By the time I post this, I will no longer be living there, so I figured I would finally tell you where I've been for the last year and some change. I've been living in a tiny village off the coast of Brittany in France. There have been a lot of guesses of where I'm living. I wasn't quite sure where they were coming from because obviously I never really talked about where I've been living. But yeah, tiny village in northwestern France. We were always here temporarily. We just sort of wanted to get our bearings in order while we prepared for what will hopefully be our final move to the country where we've just moved. But I figured I would tell you what it was like living in France this whole time. So let's go for it. I'm trying to think how I would describe my overall experience here. And I think mainly it was a period of hibernation. I had been craving for a really long time just a reprieve from big cities to focus more on nature and slower living and being more aligned with the natural cycles of life. And I definitely got that here. The thing is though, because it was in a tiny village, I was definitely detached from a lot of the comforts that I was used to back in the US. And because it was so transitory, because this was not somewhere where we were going to set up home permanently, and also because I was pregnant for the majority of our time here, and because we were stranded here because my husband didn't have his residency permit and therefore he couldn't leave the country, it really just felt like a time to hunker down, do as much work as possible, and basically hibernate, like not really live my life to the fullest. And there were definitely parts, especially in the winter, which if you know anything about this region, can get pretty dreary, rainy. Everything's kind of closed around here during the winter. So there were definitely parts where I felt maybe a little bit trapped in my situation. But before I get into sort of the more negatives of living here, let me talk about the perks. So one of the perks of living in France is their healthcare system is quite good. They have universal healthcare and it's very affordable even if you're not a part of the universal healthcare system. I never got the universal healthcare, unfortunately. I applied for it multiple times, but because of my specific situation, because I was here temporarily, and because I was coming directly from the US and not another European country, they never approved me. So that was pretty fucked up, especially because I was pregnant. But even not having health insurance, it was so affordable. You can really tell that this is a system where it's not built for profit, where even without the health insurance, you can afford out of pocket a lot of the services that you need, which just goes to show like the American healthcare system is so messed up and like really needs reform. There is no need for like the huge costs of healthcare over there. So for example, what I paid to give birth in France is less than what I would have paid with health insurance out of pocket in the US. But it definitely depends on the field. So for example, the OBGYN field is a lot more accessible, I found, than ophthalmology or dentistry. I tried to get my contact lens prescription renewed, and apparently the nearest ophthalmologist who can prescribe contact lenses lives like an hour away from me. Also, the dentistry here is not much better than in the UK. I went to get my teeth cleaned when we first arrived, and then I said, should I come back in 6 months? Because in the US, you get your teeth cleaned every 6 months, but I figured since I was pregnant, and I know that being pregnant can sometimes put you at heightened risk of dental issues, I thought maybe they would want me to come sooner. And they said, no, you can't come here if it hasn't been a year. And I tried. And I was like, listen, I will pay out of pocket. And they just straight up would not take me. And I feel disgusting because it's like, I'm due for my biannual teeth cleaning. Like, this is ridiculous. I'm paying out of pocket. But that veers more into the cons that I'm going to talk about, just regarding the attitude on working in France. To go back to some of the perks, one of the perks of living here has definitely been having a slower, more natural lifestyle, less claustrophobic. We lived like a 5-minute drive from the beach, more like 25-30-minute walk. A lot of cute little trails. It's not very mountainous, but there are trails that you can do around. A lot of hidden gems. The food ingredients are so fresh and delicious when they're in season. People are very green. They care a lot about the climate here. And I don't know how much of this is just living in a village versus living in France, but I just felt that it was a bit more slow-paced and natural of a lifestyle. In terms of how friendly the people are in Brittany, it's definitely different from in Paris. Obviously, Parisians have the reputation of being quite rude and xenophobic, and in Brittany I found that overall people are nice. They're not super warm and friendly like they would be in, say, Italy, but for the most part they're perfectly cordial. I think another perk of doing this was I got used to not having my ideal permanent living situation. I got used to making do with a little bit less, which I think is important to periodically expose yourself to a lack of comfort. But again, one of the drawbacks of that is that I find it kind of difficult to feel grounded when I know that I'm only someplace temporarily. In the past, when I used to study abroad during college, for instance, I would never put any posters up on the walls. I wouldn't personalize it. I just didn't see the point because it was so temporary. So that part has been kind of rough. Maybe now I'll segue into the downsides of living here. The worst has been the French bureaucracy. My God, the French bureaucracy is heinous. Getting a local phone number was so hard for some reason. I completely repressed the memory of why that is. All I remember is that it was incredibly hard to get a local phone number, and it shouldn't have been that hard. Like I said, never got around to the health insurance, never got approved for that. My husband's residency permit took 9 months to arrive, during which time we couldn't leave the country. That also connects to the xenophobia and the nationalism that is so rampant in a lot of France. France is very ethnocentric from what I've observed. The way that they do things is considered the right way to do things. And if you do things differently, it's definitely frowned upon. It's not allowed. You're not really allowed to deviate from the protocol. And I think a lot of that attitude contributes also to the xenophobia that has been on the rise in France. So like I said, my husband was trying to get his residency permit because he's not European like I am. And it would just be every month they would request more documents and more documents and more. And he was like, why didn't you request this the last time you said you needed more documents, right? And finally, at one point, he tried to, really get through to them. And he said, listen, my wife is about to give birth. We're also not going to be here permanently. We're going to a different country in a few months. I really need to get this resolved because otherwise I can't move. And when they heard that he's not here permanently, they just canceled his application. And we actually spoke to some immigration attorneys who flat out told us that it was probably because of xenophobia against my Romanian passport that he was applying in connection with. Because in case you're not aware, one of the demographics that the xenophobia is most rampant towards is Romanian immigrants. Also, I took 7 years of French in school. You would think that I'd be able to get around, right? But my French, I realized, will never be good enough to be embedded within French culture. If you pronounce just one word incorrectly, a lot of the times French people will look at you and just not understand it. I don't understand. It's have you never heard an accent before? Not everyone speaks exactly the same way as you, but I feel like you should understand sort of what they mean based on context clues. Also, I can't believe I forgot to mention this because this is maybe my main takeaway from my stay in France. But the attitude on working is very different. And now when I moved to Europe, I was of the opinion that I don't want to live to work. I want to work to live. But I realized after living in France, that's not actually true. I do actually enjoy having a career that gives me meaning, enjoying doing it, being in a state of flow, really looking forward to it. What I actually really wanted was just to have as much vacation as I wanted. And now being self-employed, that is kind of the case. I can sort of take off whenever I want to. Now, French people get a significant amount of vacation. I can't remember how much exactly, but basically they take off the entire month of August and then some weeks. It's a big stereotype here that nobody works the entire month of August. But even when they are working, it just sort of feels like their heart's not in it in a way that makes me worry about quality control. In some workplaces, when you show up to work in France, you spend the whole first hour saying hello to everybody, shaking everybody's hand, making small talk about their weekend. Then you take a 2-hour lunch, and then of course you have to start gearing up for lunch, then you start unwinding after lunch, and it just kind of feels like even when people are on the job, they don't really want to be there. Obviously, I'm generalizing here, I don't think this is true of all French people, all French industries, all French companies, but I'm just speaking in terms of trends compared to other places where I've lived in the past. It doesn't seem like the French really live to work. And I realized after living here, you know what, I do want want to be in a place where people are invested in what they do day to day, because it just makes me feel less anxious. If I'm not sure if somebody's going to email me back or if they're going to be reliable in a professional setting, that makes me anxious. It makes me feel like I need to be on top of it. I need to be chasing them down. I don't want to live like that. I would rather live in a place where people take their work seriously and show up consistently. Also, the taxes are extremely high, which maybe that works out if you have access to the universal healthcare system and all the other benefits that come along with living in France. But given the fact that I didn't feel altogether fair to be paying such a huge amount of taxes for not getting the benefits. And I think that this is probably directly linked to the work ethic in France, because why in the world would you put in 100% of your effort if you know that a huge chunk of that money is going to be taken out of your paycheck? When taxes are extremely high, people are not incentivized to work as much. And people are also not incentivized to be entrepreneurs as much. And I want to live in a country where it's considered good for the economy for people to go do their own thing and put out a new product and do something original and creative and shake up the industry. But if you know that you're only going to be left with 35% of your income as a self-employed person, why on earth would you put in 100% effort? I was at a creperie food truck one time, and it was the month of July, and this woman who ran the food truck was telling me that she needs to take off the whole rest of the year, because if she makes any more money, she's going to be in a different tax bracket where she would need to set up her business in a different way. So people in France are actively de-incentivized from growing their businesses. That doesn't feel right to me. For us as outsiders, there wasn't a big sense of community. I think this is also partly because we live in a village. If we had lived in a city where there were a lot of immigrants and expats, we probably would have found a sense of community, but where we lived, there just simply wasn't much of one that would accept us. Because like I said, our French will never be good enough to truly be embedded in with French culture. And there were situations where, we wanted to befriend somebody and we were straight up told, this person doesn't really like interacting with Anglophones, meaning English speakers. And we were like, okay, I don't mind interacting with francophones. We can make it work. We can figure something out, or not, I guess. Also, I'm not sure how much of this is related to living in a village rather than living in France, but there were definitely a lot of comforts that were missing that we had in the US. Sometimes when I talk about the fact that Europe as a whole is a lot less comfortable than the US, I get a lot of Europeans telling me, I don't know what you're talking about. I have all these comforts and I live in Europe. And it's yeah, but do you live in a city? Because in a city, of course, the new buildings are going to have a lot of these comforts and amenities. But the point is that Europe as a whole is much older. It's much more historical. It has a lot of buildings that don't have these modern amenities and comforts. And also, if you've ever actually lived in the US, I think you would know what I'm talking about, because people who have lived in both Europe and the US usually say yeah, America has really perfected comfort. Europe doesn't care as much about comfort. And also just by nature of where exactly we lived, we were so far from an airport. It was so incredibly hard to travel. And that part was really difficult because we do love to travel. And especially now that we have a baby, we cannot drive 6 hours to get to the Paris airport and then fly to our next destination. It's just not feasible. So I'm really glad to, in the future, be living someplace that's a lot closer to big metropolitan airports. But overall, did I like living in France? Yeah, it was temporary. If you yourself are French, I would love to hear your input because obviously I'm just speaking from my experience, but you have a lot more knowledge about French culture and maybe certain blind spots that I have. So yeah, definitely let me know down in the comments what you think. Next time I will see you will probably be from a different location. So excited for that. Spooky season will be in full force by then. I think this year I'm going to do the psychology of werewolves for Halloween. So be on the lookout for that and I'll see you soon.